Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, the symbolic issue when it comes to Bill C-8's limitations is that it doesn't necessarily impact the social context. So like I mentioned earlier, we can have legislation that creates real boundaries and creates expectations and has these symbolic messages as well, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to real social change. So just because we've created the conversation, we created legislation around it, doesn't necessarily mean that the world has changed around us, right? So much the same way that having homosexuality itself decriminalized in 1969 did not eliminate homophobia, having conversion therapy bans doesn't necessarily get rid of the practice, right? So it's just because we banned it doesn't mean that it's gone. It's not a magic bullet that we signed this and Trudeau is very happy and we fixed it. It doesn't work that way. So we have to keep that part in mind too.
Indeed. And Tom, do you want to jump in there real quick, just on the limitations?
A major limitation of Bill C-8 is that it doesn't include consent of the patient. It only says a patient cannot be forced into it, but it doesn't state like, yeah, the practitioner has to state the consequences, the studies on it, calling it a pseudoscience. It doesn't contain gender expression either. So it only contains gender identity and sexual orientation. So cisgender people can be forced and can be put into conversion therapy basically just because of their gender expression and not identify as trans whatsoever. It could be a biological female who identifies as a woman who just has a masculine gender expression. It doesn't contain that. And especially with Justin Trudeau's apology, which was not, after they passed they passed C-66, but that didn't include any of the queer men who were arrested during the bathhouse raids. And I'm looking at my notes, sorry. Without the consent part, it's a loophole because they could be given misinformation about conversion therapy and like, oh yeah, like this is gonna work, like blah, 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 blah. There won't be any consequences to your mental health or your physical health, depending on what they do in the program. It could be any type of assault in the program. And also with C-66, and even though Section 159 was repealed with C-75, Justin Trudeau's apology, it's an empty apology, especially when you don't add consent to the conversion therapy ban.
Yeah, that can be a huge issue. Obviously. It's about informed consent. There has to be informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
So many folks are, I'm going to use this word purposefully, they're groomed for conversion therapy. They're set up for it, right? So even if you say, well, they said yes. Okay, but was their yes informed? Did you give them the consequences? Did you tell them what would happen? And very frequently the answer is no. For specifically those reasons, they don't want to reveal what this will include. They don't want to talk about what the potential consequences will be.
Alrighty, and just going to move on here. So do you think this goes far enough, Bill C-8 rather, that is, or should conversion therapy be completely banned, regardless of consent of the patient?
Yeah, I think Thomas is right. We need to have informed consent within the bill, because otherwise you're creating loopholes that people will exploit. So whenever we see legislation like this, a good example would be the initial Bill 10 here in Alberta that governed GSAs. So the bill had great intentions, like the people who were designing it thought they had covered their bases. And it didn't necessarily go all the way. There were loopholes that were able to be exploited, right? So for instance, the ability it wasn't necessarily codified that an administration would have to make good on a request from a student for a GSA. So there was the timeliness issue where some administrations would say, oh, we'll get to that as soon as we have the time, as soon as we have the person, as soon as we have the resources, and basically kept their school from having a GSA because of administrative red tape. So Bill 24, the response to Bill 10 that would amend and sort of tie up a lot of those loose ends, included verbiage around timeliness, around the specific issues that were left open by Bill 10. So when we have a conversion therapy ban, we have to be cognizant of what those loopholes may or may not be. And I think that Thomas hit the nail on the head in that piece about informed consent is a huge loophole. Like, people will try to exploit that. They'll say, well, they said yes, they went willingly, but we don't qualify what that yes or what that willingly looks like, right? So unless our conversion therapy ban has a level of understanding of those loopholes and how to protect people from those loopholes being exploited, particularly when it comes to legislation that we may not get a second kick at the can at for a while. Like, we may not see amendments to Bill C-8 for a long time. We may not see an update to it for many years. So we need to get it right the first time, or at least the most right that we can, given the resources and society and the culture and the context at the time. So I think that in terms of limitation, in terms of like how further it could go, I think having informed consent be a component of the bill is vital. We need to ensure that it's not simply nebulous, right? We have to make it much the same way that we do when it comes to sexual assault. Like, consent is consent. It can't be, well, she said yes, but she was drunk, right? Like, that doesn't work that way. That's not the way that conversion therapy should work either, right? So within that metaphor, we shouldn't allow people to say, well, they went to the party, they had the drinks, they were wearing the skirt, like all those things that we gaslight survivors with, because we create these societal loopholes where folks can cast doubt. Well, did that really happen to you if you said yes at one point? Or like, we create these opportunities for people who have survived something that has been traumatic, that has been harmful to them in both physical and mental and emotional ways, preventing them from having access to the supports they need because there's loopholes. Oh, well, we can't hold the person who did this to you accountable because you technically said yes that one time, even if you didn't know it was going to happen. Like, that can't be the way that we operate when it comes to protecting vulnerable people from harmful acts. Like, we can't qualify it in that way and say, well, technically speaking, you said the magic words, therefore you must have understood, right? It doesn't quite go far enough in that regard.
Tom, did you want to add anything else in there?
Yeah, when it comes to the consent loophole, like, it should say, at least in the bill, like, you have to be at least over the age of 18 to consent, and the practitioner has to tell you A, B, C, and D about the consequences. And the studies that it's pseudoscience. If people consent to conversion therapy, this is going to sound terrible. However, they should be allowed to do it because it's their body and their mind. But if they were given the proper information about conversion therapy beforehand, they probably wouldn't want to go through with conversion therapy after knowing it's a pseudoscience and it causes harm to, psychologically and sometimes physically. So that the consent loophole is a big issue.
I mean, I think the analogy here, is that we ask trans people to jump through a million hoops just to be able to affirm who they are. And the reasons for those hoops, I don't agree necessarily with all the hoops in place, but I think that there is a case to be made that we should be ascertaining, is this person of sound mind? Is this person aware of what the consequences for their body will be? Like, are we doing the correct steps? Like, is this person informed? Are they in a good state of mind? Do they acknowledge, are they informed of and acknowledge what may come, right? Are they, it's basically like when we have these sort of hoops for trans people to jump through, at their heart, the idea is we just want to make sure that you are committed to this, right? Do I think that we always do a great job at how those hoops are set up? No, I think that in many ways we make it too hard for a lot of trans people to be able to do what they need to do, just because of access, because of we have to see this specialist and this specialist and this specialist, and every one of them's an 8-month wait. We're going to make you live as your fellow gender for a whole year and document it before we'll do anything. Like a lot of these things are, I think, in many ways bottlenecking. They're overstepping in many ways. But I think that if we want to use that as a framework and a basis for how we would approach people who are adults who want to partake in conversion therapy for themselves, I think that's a fairly good framework to start with. Is, okay, well, are you of sound mind? Have you been informed of all the consequences? How committed are you? Let's check in 6 months to make sure you're still committed to this course of action. Like, I think if we had more of that, I think we could probably meet in the middle on conversion therapy, because I think that you're not incorrect. I think that free will being what it is, we should allow people to be able to be able to seek out conversion therapy if they truly want it. The problem, I think, is that if they truly want it, is in and of itself, like, that's going to be a hard definition of terms, right? So you're going to have people who could have, like I mentioned earlier, they could have been gaslit or groomed for many, many years to want this, right? But the reality is that they were denied the opportunity to understand what their options are. They were denied opportunity to be supported for who they are. So they think, well, this is the only way that I'll be supported. This is the only way I'll be accepted. Like, there's a lot of coercive ways that our free will isn't necessarily just ours, right? So we're conditioned by the world around us to want certain things, to want to behave in certain ways. So yes, free will obviously is our right to have. But by the same token, we're not always supplying individuals with the information and support that they need to make real informed choices for themselves. So their free will is in many ways guided. Even if it's still their choice, their choices are sort of given to them in many ways. They're sort of guided towards certain choices. So that's my reservation when it comes to the free will argument when it comes to conversion therapy, is that, yes, I do agree with that, but I don't think it's as easy and clear cut as adult person making a choice, their free will, it's all good, because there's people manipulating what those choices are in many cases. So I think that should we take that into account? And I think that we should. We have to have a framework for ascertaining, well, does this person have they been given the proper information to realistically consent to what they're undergoing? Because I don't discount the fact that there will be people who will say that it's too hard to be me. I want to change this aspect because I think it will help me live a happier life, a safer life, a more secure life. I don't necessarily agree with the course of action. I would rather, well, why do you not feel safe? Why do you not feel secure? Can we address things in other ways before we subject you to something that's completely horrible and fabricated and ineffective and damaging? Like, can we find other ways? I don't think that we should be preventing people, because we prevent people from self-harm all the time, right? Like when we have people who are on holds, mental health holds, we do these things already, where folks who are at risk of harming themselves aren't able to. And I do see conversion therapy as a version of self-harm. Somebody may be convinced of the necessity of that self-harm, but I still think that we should be trying to educate away from it and support people before subjecting them to mental and physical torture. I think should be the goal of a sane society, is, can we just not have people have to, I don't want that to be someone's option. I still think we should allow people the option if they choose it, but we should be doing everything in our power to ensure that they don't need that option, because it's not effective. It's not actually going to fix what they think it's going to fix. And we know that through studies. Like, so many psychological studies into conversion therapy prove you can't hurt somebody into being a different person. You can modify behaviors, and you can modify conditioning and your reflexes and the way that you respond to the world around you, but it doesn't fundamentally change who you are. Like, you can make somebody flinch away from intimacy with someone, with a demographic of people that you think they shouldn't be intimate with. You can condition that person to respond poorly to that intimacy, but you haven't changed the person. You've just changed their behavior. And I think that ultimately is the fundamental misunderstanding when it comes to conversion therapy, that the people who are proponents of it think you're changing a person. All you're doing is changing the service behavior, and that's all that you really cared about. You didn't care about the person, you cared about changing their behavior to be more acceptable to you. So to that end, those people may see conversion therapy as successful because you're changing the behavior, right? But ultimately, all you're doing is damaging a person and making them unable to be holistically themselves. And in many ways, people who have undergone conversion therapy at length, particularly those who've undergone it over the course of months and years, it's effectively PTSD. It's brainwashing. It's unmaking a person to build them in a different image that you find more socially acceptable. And at the end of the day, that is psychological harm. That is in many ways physical harm. And you're destroying a person to try and remake them in your image, and it's just not functional. And at the end of the day, we have to, anyone who wants to exercise their free will to partake in conversion therapy for themselves, they need to be informed of that. That needs to be conveyed to them. Here we are. Like, the ban will still happen. Like, it's still coming. Navigating the free will aspect of it is vital. I think that's an important philosophical and moral question for our society. Like, who are we as a society? And I think ultimately it comes back to my earlier points about not just addressing symptoms, but addressing root causes. Like, why do we have conversion therapy? Why do people believe it works? Why do people think that it's an option for them? Like, why do these things exist? And can we, in concert and coordination with the conversion therapy ban on a legislative side, what can we be doing as a society to help people not need it, not promote it, not conduct it, not choose it? Like, what can we do to make conversion therapy, if not outright gone, but how can we limit it? How can we limit its power? How can we limit its spread? How can we limit its dangerous effects? How can we limit the stigmatization of survivors? How can we limit the dangers and the harms that conversion therapy can cause? I think that's not necessarily a legislative question. In many ways, it's more of a social question.
Indeed. And for the next question, I just want to ask, what would you say to somebody if they respond to Bill C-8 with the point of, well, what about my religious freedom? What about my religious freedom? How do you respond to that?
So I think that religious freedom is also important, but the other fact of religious freedom is that other people have the freedom from your religion. So we can't frame it in, it's my religion to hurt people, because we don't allow for that. Like, if someone's religion was human sacrifice, we wouldn't allow that either, right? Like, just because you have religious freedom does not mean that that's absolute. It doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want and say, it's part of my religion, I get to do it now. It doesn't work that way. There are, much the same way that we have freedom of expression and we have freedom of religion, there are reasonable limitations on those rights, on those freedoms. Like, just because you have freedom of religion doesn't mean that it is all encompassing and that it's basically an unlimited get or jail free card for whatever you do. There are reasonable limitations, and I think the harm is a very, I would like to think, easy and agreeable limitation. So I think it's reasonable to say that if an aspect of your religion is undeniably harmful, then you don't get to have that freedom, right? That doesn't mean that you're going to be persecuted, or that your religion is banned, or that you can't practice it, but you just can't practice those elements that are harmful. And I think that that's true of all groups. Like, it's true of every community. It's true of every social class. It's true of every culture, every aspect of our society. Like, we have these freedoms, but we don't necessarily have them unlimitedly. We have to have reasonable expectations of safety, of dignity, of equality. And if you're exercising your religious freedom to infringe upon somebody else's freedom to exist as they are with dignity and equality and free from harm, then I think that that's unreasonable. That is not a reasonable exercise of religious freedom. It's just not. Like we can't, much the same way that we don't pardon people within religious institutions who have engaged in sexual misconduct and all the varieties therein. We don't forgive them because they were exercising their religious freedom. That's not how we conduct ourselves. And again, I think when we talk about, well, is it harm if you're having a conversation to lead somebody towards an expression of their identity that is more in keeping with religious practices? Gray zone. Like, and again, that this is the problem with a lot of the conversation around conversion therapy, is that we like it to be black and white, but it can be a lot more gray. Do these people who are having these conversations with somebody who is struggling, are they aware that they're causing harm? Are they aware of the dangers of what they're doing? I don't think they always are. I think that they're more often than not very honestly trying to do right by somebody, trying to support them, trying to help them. But that, I don't think that ultimately it's not always going to be a good exercising of religious freedom. Because if you're harming somebody, if you're hurting them, if you're putting them in a position to feel unsupported or intimidated, is that a great way of exercising your religion? Not to mention the fact that even on a theological level, which I am no theologian, but I've certainly read a lot from folks who both specialize in theology as well as conversion therapy. Pam Rocker out of Calgary is an amazing resource, and she has a lot of knowledge to share, and a lot of experience with conversion therapy as well. Conversion therapy isn't in keeping with religious doctrine. We can use religion as a justification for it, but I don't think that holds water. Theologically speaking, that's not actually a fundamental piece of religions. People may fold it into their religion and certainly fold it into their practice, but I still don't think that makes a legitimate expression of their religion. It's just not, because you're harming somebody else.
And Tom?
Well, since Canada's major religion is Catholicism and Christianity, I kind of did some digging into the original translations of the Bible. And the original translation of the Bible says nothing about homosexuality whatsoever.
No.
Like before 1946, the English translation of Leviticus 18:22 was that man shall not lie with young boys as he does with a woman, for it is an abomination. Or there's also the same, another translation of the same verse, two men shall not lie in the bed of a woman, for it is an abomination. And there's also, I think it's Leviticus 20:13, you cannot lie. Both Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 kind of are almost the same. It states that you shall not lie in the bed of a man, but doesn't specify gender whatsoever. And there's also Romans, which is thought to be homosexuality versus heterosexuality. But in Roman Greece, in that society, everyone was expected to be bisexual. And so it was okay for a woman to have one husband, not sleep with no other men, but also be able to sleep with as many women as she wanted. But for men, it was expected to have multiple wives and be a teacher, mentor, and a lover to an adolescent male. And there's one more. I think where is it? And Timothy, those who lie with males is a sin, but it doesn't say which gender. And also the story of Adam and Eve is used to promote homophobia. However, they use people used reproducing the human race. However, reproduction was never part of the original state. It only happened after the fall. So, and there's also women cannot dress as like a man, and men cannot dress as women, which that isn't being trans. That's cross-dressing. However, in modern days, are you going to tell a woman not to wear pants? Frankly, it's and also for non-binary people, it's for Adam and Eve are referred to female and male. However, it's only referring to them as female and male, and to say that there's only female and male there's only two sexes, meaning there's only two genders, that completely goes against what we know about genetics now in modern science. There's not just XX and XY.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the problem isn't religious expression specifically. It's actually just it's using that as a convenient justification, particularly when you're cherry picking. Like it's interesting to me that we see the same handful of multiple passages that are translated multiple times through multiple different languages with various hands holding the pens, always influencing the translation. Like even just in terms of translation itself, there's a lot of studies into how who's doing the translation impacts what ultimately the end result is. There was a really fun example. Fun for me because I'm a former English major. There was the first woman ever to translate the Odyssey. So Homer's The Odyssey. Did so only about 3 or 4 years ago. It's relatively recent. The first woman ever translated it. And then when comparing what her translation was to all the slew of male translations over the centuries, highlighted the way in which perspective and language and society and context all are influenced there. And I think that we see the same dynamic at play when it comes to religious texts, is that we see these texts that are thousands of years old being translated, retranslated, different hands holding the pens, all these different factors. And then now we have modern people who don't fundamentally study the text. They just behave in accordance with what they believe is in it, who in many ways without critical thought, they just cherry pick and they do what they think is in there, or they're told what's in there and they just behave in that way, which completely fair. Freedom of religion. I think that's the purpose of it, is you get to practice your religion in the way that works best for you. So that I'm not particularly judgmental on that specifically. It's more of the consequence of it is that you have folks who don't realize that they're cherry picking, and they don't realize that they're trying to use mistranslated or differently translated passages to justify harming people. And I think that my issue with that isn't necessarily the religion, it's not even necessarily religious expression, it's the mentality that goes into that, like what feeds that way of performing your religion or enacting it. What mindsets lead to folks being uncritical of the way in which they're behaving? Like, do they ever think, well, maybe we should, who is there a contrasting opinion on this? Like, is this the only opinion of what this is? Like, a lot of people, I think, embark within their faith in uncritical ways, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I think that we should be critical of all of our beliefs, and that's secular and religious. I think that we should be doing check-ins with ourselves. Like, do I feel represented by what these beliefs are? These beliefs, are they good? Are they good for people around me? Are they good for me? Are they good for people who aren't like me? I don't think we do enough self-reflection that way, again, because it comes back to the thing I touched on earlier, that we're all afraid of being wrong. Our institutions, the established ways of being, the ways in which we believe, the ways in which we act, the way in which we move through the world, we just don't want to be wrong. And it leads to us being, I think it leads to, and I don't want to focus on individuals or even individual religions, it just leads to a society-wide predilection away from being critical, away from being nuanced, away from being wrong, we position ourselves away from those things because they're challenging, they're difficult. And I think that ultimately when it comes to the way in which some people will use freedom of religion as sort of a shield to be able to justify hurting others, even if that, we have to also acknowledge that is at best a small minority of people. And then there's other folks who just haven't thought critically, who just get swept along with it because they're seeing the rest of, and to forgive me for using my sociology background a little bit, like in-group, out-group dynamics. Like you want to be part of that in-group. You want to be, well, if all the other people who go to my church are saying this, then it's what we believe as a group, right? So it's not always coming from a place of real thoughtful malice or real thoughtful willfulness, right? It's sometimes just like it's what the group believes, so we believe it. We're all, every last one of us is capable of falling into that pattern of behavior because we're social creatures by definition. Humans are social, so we often pattern our beliefs and our actions around the people around us that we consider our in group. So who is my group? Who is my culture? Who is my society? Who is my people? Like who are my people? And we will often frame ourselves and the way that we think about things, the way that what we criticize, what we don't criticize, what we accept without question, what we won't accept without question. We frame those things based around those around us. It's just a shorthand. It's especially in a modern society where it's honestly quite overwhelming most of the time. Like we're all very overwhelmed by the constant everything all the time. So for many of us, that shorthand isn't even necessarily a conscious decision on our part. It's just we don't have a whole lot of time to consider whether or not we're exercising our freedom of religion in ways that is helpful or harmful. Like we don't necessarily, like that's not going to be the first thing people think of. It's not going to be the thing that people consider because they have a million and one other things going on, particularly when we think about how queer and trans people may not even intersect with a lot of people's lives, right? So they aren't, like, the queer and trans community isn't going to be priority number one for a lot of people, right? And that's just a reality of the world that we live in, where that community is not going to be number one priority. And the consequence of that is much the same way that when we spoke earlier about the UCP and that mindset of governing for the in-group rather than governing for the totality of all of us. It's a very similar thing. We have that mindset of, well, it's not a factor in my life, so I'm not going to consider it. I'm not going to dedicate a lot of thought to it. It may not even, like, and again, that's not necessarily a conscious decision on people's parts. It's just a function of we're sort of in our bubbles, we're sort of in our little cultures, our own little groups. And if something comes to our attention that isn't part of that group, are we going to necessarily weigh it the same way, right? So that dynamic of in-group and out-group behaviors, it is a factor when it comes to the reasons why some people think it's their religious freedom to hurt other people and why they'll use that as a justification.
Yeah, cherry picking versus for confirmation bias to further fuel your abuse.
Absolutely.
And just the final question I just have on the list here. Do you believe that 5 years of practicing non-consent conversion therapy is a sufficient punishment? 5 years in jail?
This is a difficult thing to ascertain. Because I don't know what the appropriate punishment should be. I personally have a lot of misgivings about the way in which we enact our criminal justice system. I think that in many ways we should be focusing more on restorative justice than punitive justice, because realistically speaking, if all we're doing is just punishing people who practice conversion therapy and throwing them in jail for 5 years, have we changed anything, right? That person is not likely to come out of incarceration believing that what they did was wrong. Right? They may have actually the double down. My fear is that the more that we hinge a lot of things on punishment, we're leaning away from education. We're leaning away from helping people to understand what they're doing, right? So we're creating a scenario where for lack of a better term, we're creating martyrs. Like, we're creating people who are going to be seen as champions of a cause, who are now being punished by a state for the crime of trying to help people, is how it could be framed, right? So we haven't necessarily seen that happen yet, but it's my concern going forward that the more that we lean on punitive measures instead of education, empathy, and restorative justice, and really working with where people are at, we're not changing behaviors, we're just punishing people. And I think that in some cases can lead to a sense of just sweeping it under the rug. Like, oh, we're punishing the people who are doing it, so we're fixing conversion therapy, right? I don't think that necessarily changes, again, those root causes. We're not necessarily, through punishment, correcting the scenario that we're seeing on the ground. So we're not necessarily stopping people from doing it, because punishing people for drunk driving doesn't necessarily stop everyone from drunk driving. Punishing people for any number of crimes doesn't always lead to those crimes going down. It certainly helps, but like when it comes to conversion therapy, if the goal is to eliminate it from society completely, I don't think that punishment is the best tool for that job, because it's just going to create a scenario where there will be people, the world in which conversion therapy lives is one that is expecting society to punish them, is expecting that oppositional defiance, that they're expecting conflict. So the more that they're met with what their expectation is, the more they're going to double down on that behavior, the more they're going to double down on the justifications, all of those pieces. Now, that said, we are talking about a practice which is inherently torturous. It's inherently damaging, both mentally and physically. So should there be consequences for that? I think yes, but I think the consequences should be, the goal should always be on how do we prevent further conversion therapy? How do we create justice for survivors? How do we create safety for people who could be at risk of being put into conversion therapy? And strict, like just punishments on their own, I don't think accomplish that goal. I don't think that they'll ever on their own reach that goal. We need to have that, the sort of the social, the push from behind, like the social push to address the root causes. So is 5 years enough? I think we should be aligning it to any sort of legislation and punishments around any other kinds of harm that are physical and emotional harm. So they should be the same kind of punishments. That said, that's for consistency. I think they should be consistent with existing punishments. I also believe that we should be moving away from punishment as a main form of crime prevention, because it just isn't functionally going to work. It's not going to eliminate the crime that we're trying to prevent. It's not going to help survivors if all we're doing is punishing people, throwing away the key. Sometimes all we're teaching people is how not to get caught. And that's my biggest fear, is that the more that conversion therapy is, the expectation is that we banned it, therefore it's gone, and we punish those who we catch. The reality is that it's just going to drive the practice underground. It's going to drive people to further protect themselves, especially as they see the punishments being levied. So I think that punishments are fine. I get it. Like we have a criminal justice system that requires people who are sentenced to jail to be in jail for a length of time. I know that the minimum, I think, is 2 years for a lot of, or the maximum for some of the statutes is 2 years, and the maximum for the highest maximum is 5 years. I think that's for taking a youth outside the country for the sake of conversion therapy. I forget the exact statute that carries the 5-year term. I don't think that that's unreasonable, because we'll very rarely see that punishment being doled out. Much the same way that we didn't see people getting tossed into misgendering jail, we're probably not going to see a slew of people being incarcerated for practicing conversion therapy. I think that the courts will likely, particularly if any individual case may have the risk of being choppy, particularly when it comes to charter challenges or any of those sort of legal challenges that may come of it. There may be, on the judicial side of things, more of a hesitation to be draconian and like go for the harshest punishment every time. I think we'll probably see a more restrained response. So I don't think we'll actually see the 2 and 5 year maximums being exercised all that frequently, if at all. I think we're much more likely to see the courts side more on the side of caution and not wanting to throw the book at somebody just for the sake of doing it. I think we'll probably see more of like the 1 year, the 2 years. We'll probably see like a much more limited sentences in scope. But do I think that that's enough or it goes far enough? I don't know that I'm the best judge of that. I did some reading on it, and I think we just need to align it with other forms of harm, all the various forms of psychological harm, physical harm. We just need to align to those things, and then hopefully when we embrace a justice system that isn't explicitly just punitive in nature, we'll get away from sentencing itself being the goal.
And Tom, did you want to add anything?
Well, it's for advertising conversion therapy, it's 2 years, and then for taking kids out of the country for conversion therapy, practicing conversion therapy, or any of that is 5 years, which the maximum punishment for assault is 14 years. And so,
what's the sentence for kidnapping? Because I would expect that the taking a minor outside the country for the purposes of conversion therapy would more or less align with whatever the statutes and the sentencing guidelines would be for kidnapping. That's what I would expect. I'm certainly no lawyer. Please do not take legal advice from me. I'm not going to help you.
It says when I type it into Google, it's 20 years kidnapping. So like going the route of putting people in jail for practicing conversion therapy or forcing someone into conversion therapy or advertising conversion therapy, I'd hope they'd like add on charges for like if physical assault. However, the restorative justice aspect of it, instead of prison, it'd probably be better for people to be mandatory courses, and you have to work with this organization for this length of time, and you have to work with queer and trans people instead of just jail time, or maybe jail time and restorative justice.
Yeah, I don't think that it's improper to have jail time for crimes. Like we that's the way that our system is set up. I don't think it's wrong to have jail time be attached to crimes. Like that's fine. I think that you're right. I think it comes back to how do we change things? How do we make things better? And I think that it does come from the same way that we have when people get DUIs, they have to go through courses. They have there are reasonable expectations of how to course correct, for lack of a better term, criminal behavior and behavior that we as a society have deemed harmful. I think that strictly punishing people is never going to get us the whole way there. I think that we need to focus on that education piece, focus on, do you actually acknowledge that what you did was wrong? Do you understand why it was wrong? If the answer to those questions is no, then I think that sentencing someone to jail is not going to magically make that difference. So I think you're right. I think it goes back to like mandatory courses, working with specific organizations, community time to like pay restitution to the community that you've been actively harming. And I think obviously opening practitioners up to civil cases where survivors can be able to reclaim some level of financial support to be able to, because the consequences of conversion therapy require quite substantial psychological assistance after the fact, upwards of years in many cases, because you're talking about having to support someone who's been broken apart mentally and then put back together in a different image. It's like basically you have to break the bone to reset it again. So it's a very long and in many cases very difficult road. So I think that any sort of justice that we're looking at should allow for survivors to be able to petition the courts for that support being covered by the person who did the harm. I think that is what justice should look like. Like if the person who harmed you pays for helping you out of that, like how to support that person is the critical piece for me. I think that our justice should be centered on what does a survivor need? Like what are their needs and how can they be best served by the justice system rather than just simply making it about punishing wrongdoers. We should be focusing more on supporting those who have been wronged. I think in many ways, the financial aspect for a great deal of institutions, particularly those religious in nature, could be the key determinative factor in whether or not they change and shift the behavior. So when we hold these institutions accountable in a financial sense, it just becomes untenable for them to continue that practice. They have to respond. They have to change their behaviors. It's the same way that we saw the large settlements out of the States when it comes to individuals who were sexually harmed within the Catholic Church institution. The simply saying you did wrong didn't really change a lot of the practices. Like, there were still so many survivors, even in terms of contemporary times. It's not just always in the past. So we're still seeing, we still saw, even whenever it had become such a societal, culturally known to all people, that there were jokes in TV and movies back in the 90s about what a priest might do, right? Like, not that those jokes are at all okay. They're terrible, but they existed. And the fact that they existed is itself a testament to how prevalent the problem was, and we all acknowledged it. But there was no consequences until there were financial consequences. And all of a sudden, the institutions that were perpetrating this wrongdoing were, in many ways, their hand was forced. They had to respond because the money was coming out of them. So I think that, not that I enjoy the idea of using finances as a carrot or a stick, I think in this particular instance, it is going to be a factor. Supporting survivors and having the institutions that facilitated the harm having to pay restitution to those who survived the harm, I think that's actually in many ways more of a consequence than jail time. Jail time has an impact, but it's not going to address the culture within that institution, the culture within that whatever that group is, religious or secular. Like, we can't always frame conversion therapy around the world of religion. It very frequently is. I think probably the majority of conversion therapy is undertaken with a religious lens, but there are people who are secular in nature who practice conversion therapy. We need to acknowledge that as well, but they're still bolstered and supported by an institution, by a structure, by something around them, right? They're not just doing it out of the back of their house. Like, they're sustained and supported by an institution which should be paying restitution to survivors. I think that ultimately may have more of a societal change effect than simply punitive.
Yeah, because there needs to be the education part, as well as, like, there needs to be a sufficient punishment to deter people away from practicing conversion therapy and advertising conversion therapy. So there needs to be, like, that balance towards creating actual change.
Exactly.
Alrighty, well, that brings us to the end of our questions here. If you guys want to kind of add anything else, any sort of closing statements on all we've talked about, whether that be on Bill C-8 or other issues involving the queer and trans community or the UCP government?
There's a lot to say. I think the big message is that at a time when things are very partisan, where things are very divided, and understanding and willingness to be wrong are harder to come by, certainly more of a rarity, I think it's important that rather than simply just lean into the things that feel good, and we feel like, oh, my group is saying this thing about that other group, I'm winning. Like, we can't frame society around that. We as challenging as it may be for us, we have to realize that just because people don't believe the same things as us and don't behave in the way that we think they should, they're still a part of the world around us, and we have to take them as they are and move them towards hopefully less harmful things, more accepting mindsets. Like, we have to be able to, for lack of a better term, love the sinner but hate the sin. Trite and stereotypical, but like, we have to work to a point where we are enabling people to change. I think right now the society, the environment that we're existing in is very resistant to change, both changing ourselves, changing society at large. Like, we don't want to be challenged. We don't challenge ourselves. We don't challenge others. We attack or we defend. It's very very much that mindset of we attack them, we cancel them, we do this to them, we whatever it is, right? Unless we're actively working to change the scenario, we're just going in circles. And that goes for everyone who may be listening. It's across the board. It's across partisan lines. It's across religion and secular worlds. We're just not, as a society, in a place where we want to challenge ourselves. And a lot of the realities of modern life are challenging for us. Like we have to change our mindsets. We have to, like Jordan Peterson may have to not misgender people anymore, and that's a challenge for him. Like we have to challenge ourselves to be better. We have to challenge ourselves to believe that things can get better. Because I think there's a creeping nihilism. I see it in the youth that we work with on a constant basis. Like youth just kind of gave up on the world getting better because all they see is a never-ending conga line of the world getting worse. And I think that we need to be able to envision a better future, and that requires some challenging conversations at least.
Indeed. Tom, do you want to say anything else?
Well, with currently the drama happening with J.K. Rowling, yeah, our society has a problem with being wrong and only listening to people and sources who confirm our biases, and we have to be able to listen to both sides instead of just ours, and we have to be okay with being wrong. I mean, last time I checked, Bill C-8 was only introduced into the House. Now it's back in March. They haven't worked on it, well, because they've been busy.
Yeah.
The
end of the world kind of happened.
Yeah, the end of the world kind of happened in March. So they haven't gotten back to it, which I'm not gonna be like, you have to get back to working on C-8 and banning conversion therapy. It's like, no. They have to work on COVID-19. So, I mean, hopefully there can be improvements to the bill in the House or possibly in the Senate when it comes to the consent loophole. And hopefully that can be fixed.
I agree. They still have the time. Like they still have the time and the opportunity. I think that having met some of the ministers involved, I think their heart's in the right place. I think they're on the right track. I think that through consultation and through understanding, this is a consideration we didn't have. Hopefully they take that into account, because it can be very difficult at the legislative level to have a full understanding of all of the issues that could come, which is why when they introduce legislation, there is a great deal of public rhetoric. We have conversations about exactly this, right? So I hope that they take those things into account, because the bill is very workable. It's in many ways, aside from I think Spain, it might be the most progressive federal conversion therapy ban in the entire world. So I think we shouldn't necessarily, we can't forget that fact either, but that's encouragement to go further. If we've already done this much, why not make it the best it can be rather than settle for, well, we did better than other people, so we can stop now, which I think is a Canadianism, where we sort of compare ourselves to other countries and say, well, we're doing better than that, so we're doing fine, right? So better than X equals we're doing good, and we don't think about how we can refine, how we can progress, how we can achieve higher than just better than the worst, right? We compare ourselves to countries that are objectively just doing terribly in many ways. And then we say, well, we're doing better than that, so shouldn't we be happy? We can be content in that we're not doing that poorly, but we should aspire to better.
Yeah, how we have been, over the past couple months, we've been looking at the United States in relation to police brutality, but we don't look at ourselves and say how and discuss how we can improve on our how we treat Indigenous people, how we treat other people of color.
100%. I think that is I think it's a very natural mindset, in that we compare ourselves. We in every area of life, we compare ourselves to others. Like it's the reason why we, like, we as people, just we compare ourselves to others. So we as a society and as a country comparing ourselves to other countries and saying, well, at least we're not that. Like it's often felt like Canada is very content to be like we're in the top 10, like, but we don't want to be number one. If that makes sense. Like we're okay being fourth or fifth. Like, and those aren't bad things. And that's, to be very clear, fourth or fifth out of the hundreds of countries in the world is good. Like that's a great thing to achieve. But especially when we know what the loopholes are, when we know where the areas for refinement are, we should be pushing for greatness, not better than, right? We can't just always think in that comparative sense. We have to be actually aspirational. We should be a leader. Canada could be a leader in many ways. And I think sometimes we are afraid of being leaders. We're afraid of for achieving more. We just sort of assess where everyone else is and just do a little bit better than them. And then we sort of rest on that. And we could do more.
Absolutely. Well, I think that brings us to about the end of our show. So first off, I want a very big thank you to Michael, our first of hopefully many guests on. It was a very interesting conversation, and it's actually, I learned quite a bit myself during this. From both you and from Tom as well. So I want to thank you both for your input. I want to thank you as well for the work you do with the altView Foundation. Keep at her, and I hope people look forward to seeing more from you. So
I bet that you will. Thank you very much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure. Aside from that one little bit where my throat closed when I died, but other than that, it's
well, in post, it's the editing magic. Well,
the magic of post means nothing happened. Everything was fantastic and flawless.
Indeed. Alrighty, well, I think we'll sign off here. So join us next time when we have a new name for Tom's mug. Take care.